Okay. So we are doing the Sermon on the Mount. And first of all, thank you guys who were able to join us for movie night. That was fun last time. And hopefully one of the reasons we really wanted to do it last week. And for those of you who didn't have a chance to see it, please go on to angelstudios.com. And it's just a great series to watch maybe over the Thanksgiving and holidays if you have some downtime.
And it's free.
And it's free. But the whole idea of who Jesus was speaking to and just the number of people and that they weren't the important people. The Sermon on the Mount is in Matthew. It's the only gospel it's in. There are similar teachings in the other gospels, especially in Luke. And in Luke, it's called the Sermon on the Plain. And that's not to say there's inconsistencies at all. It's to say that he was preaching this message in different places in Israel during his 3 years of preaching. This story really starts back in Matthew 4, when in Matthew 4, Matthew states that Jesus started his public ministry, and his preaching from then on was about the kingdom being near. The kingdom is near. And that's important as we look at Matthew 5. The other thing that we talked about last week were disciples, and that not to confuse us, that disciples are, when he is talking about disciples here, he's not talking about the 12. In fact, all the 12 were not selected at this time. He was talking, and Scott did a deeper dive into what a disciple means, but these were his followers that were willing to follow his teaching. And last week we got through some of the first part, and it is and it was sort of described in The Chosen as being a roadmap to who Jesus, where you could find Jesus teaching, who would be listening to him. And the blessed are that, and we're going to take up at where we were on the blessed, but I was going to read first from The Chosen, if that's okay, Scott. The Chosen puts out, The Chosen is this TV series we were talking about. They put out a devotional. His wife, Dallas Jenkins' wife, and one other woman, and Dallas, write a 40-day devotion. They've written it for the last 2 seasons, and the third one has just come out. And the first day of the day 1 is said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." And so that is how we started last week. And that is Matthew 5, 2 and 3. And I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs in here. In his famous Sermon on the Mount, Jesus wasn't talking about money, though being financially poor sometimes makes it easier to be poor in spirit. Lack of any kind has a way of tenderizing our hearts and exposing our real need. Conversely, wealth sometimes makes it harder to be poor in spirit, since it fosters self-sufficiency and even pride, which are enemies of the lowly posture required to be poor in spirit. No, the poor Jesus referred to are those who are ready and willing to look to God for help, because when we recognize our own spiritual bankruptcy, our desperate need to be saved from sin and all of its consequences, we get real low, real fast. And if we're smart, we stay there. To be poor in spirit means to take a knee now and forevermore. It means to live in surrender to our Savior, relying on him for help we can't possibly provide ourselves. Safe to say, Jesus was teaching his disciples about a new and uncommon way to live, not only in attitude, but also in awareness, because Jesus spoke of a kingdom that is not of this world. He wasn't merely teaching his followers about making good choices, though we should obey God's word and try to be more like Jesus. While our choices are important, they weren't the focus of his sermon. Rather, Jesus wanted his followers to see and understand their new reality, and that life here wasn't all there is. Jesus came offering himself and everything that belongs to him, which includes kingdom membership. When we embrace him, we're in spite of the fact that we still live here. And the knowledge of that should change everything. We're here, but only for now. Our circumstances are difficult, but only for now. Our pain and suffering are real, but only for now. Sin and sickness and strife are part of our lives, but only for now.
So I always like to say, I know when somebody is telling is right, because it's when they agree with me. And no, but you see a lot of the similarities. And as Mary said last week, you look at these and what you see in it, if you picture these blessed are as being the characteristics you see in Jesus himself, it makes a lot more sense. And I think the other big thing is that a lot of people tend to see that you'll have a certain person who's a peacemaker, or a group of people, that one is, and then you have another, these are poor in spirit, as if we're only entitled to be one of these things. And it's absolutely not that way. And that's where, if you look, you see examples of all of this in Jesus himself. He is, though, letting these people know that they're important. And in this work that he's doing, they are going to be vitally important. They're the ones that the kingdom is built around. And so that's what he's introducing them to. And they would not have heard anything like this in that structure of that time from the leaders, the Pharisees and Sadducees. They wouldn't have heard that. They're looked at as just sort of the ones that are there to keep the money flowing. So with that in mind, last week we got to the meek. The
So
next
do you want me to
one.
read from 6?
What's that?
Do you want me to read from Matthew 5:6?
He was afraid I was going to read. Go right ahead.
I was not. Okay.
That's my
Blessed of those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the poor in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for the same way they persecuted the prophets before you.
So I guess let's start at the beginning. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And as I read commentaries and then comments that people make, I'm kind of amazed how many people read that and yet somehow see it as those who hunger and thirst for justice. And justice and righteousness are absolutely two different things. To hunger and thirst for righteousness, I suppose, you can hunger and thirst for righteousness out of other people. But if your goal for yourself, you hunger and thirst for righteousness, you'll be filled. If you seek, you'll find it. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. And mercy is one of these funny things too. One of my favorite scriptures has always been Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of us but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God? And we already covered justice. But mercy, mostly we don't love mercy. We expect justice. We expect to see people get what they have coming. The first part of that. And actually what Micah said was to act justly, but to love mercy. Mercy doesn't happen until you have someone under your thumb until you have them in your clutches. It's not mercy. I mean, you can be kindly disposed to someone, but mercy is the thing where you let someone off the hook. And to love mercy, we always see this, yeah, but if you show mercy, doesn't that negate justice? And there's an argument for that. So he is sort of previewing, this is early in his ministry, this idea of being shown mercy. And I think it's it's an important piece. Mary, you have anything on that?
No.
All right. We were trying to get down. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Does that mean at the end after they die? And I think that it probably does, but it also means right now that we see God in this world around us. And you have to remember who it is that's hearing this. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. And all of this is sort of tied together as we, continually come back to. It's sort of one teaching, mercy and being a peacemaker. But the main thing on being a peacemaker is you've got to step in between two people who are fighting. And what generally happens, Mary, what happens when you step between two people who are fighting?
Both of them don't like you usually.
That's generally the case. They both get mad at you, but it is this, Jesus is referred to as the Prince of Peace. And those who take that approach, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. And I have to say, I'm not a peacemaker. I wrestle with this all the time. I have such a tendency to pick one side or the other and go, yeah, okay, no, you're right, you're wrong, and step in the middle of it in entirely the wrong way. And it's this is one of the things that I kind of struggle with. But now we get down to blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Persecuted because of righteousness. And you think, why would anybody be persecuted for being righteous? It happens all the time. But read the next one, because this is tied together. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. That's a reminder that he's talking to disciples. He's talking to people who are following him. Why would anybody be persecuted for his sake unless they were doing his work? So he's saying, if you pick this, cross up, this burden up to follow me, there are going to be people who persecute you for it. There will be people who resent it. And we see it today all the time. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way, they persecuted the prophets before you. And I've sort of been working my way down to this last part about them persecuting the prophets. There's a point where Jesus tells his followers, expect them to persecute you. No servant is greater than his master. And so if they persecute me, they're going to persecute you. The prophets who were sent, and he says in that way, they persecuted the prophets before you. The prophets came often. They were sent by God to Jewish leadership, to the kings, to say, you're messing up here. You need to change your ways. And they often said things, and I'm going to cover this, but they often said things that were sort of contrary to, I don't want to say to the law, but they were contrary to what they had turned the law into. And Isaiah at one point says, for the Lord says, I desire mercy more than sacrifices. Jesus quotes that to the Pharisees at one point. You should go and learn what this means. And he quotes Isaiah, I desire mercy more than sacrifices, or I desire mercy and not sacrifices. So how do you pull all that together? Jerusalem is known, and the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem is known as a killer of prophets. They have been. The prophets are sent directly by God, and the leaders in Jerusalem have them killed. Over and over again, they persecute them, and many of them get killed. And I brought a couple of references on that, and hopefully I'll tie it all together. I see some puzzled looks, but there's a place where Jesus approached Jerusalem and he wept and said, if only you had known on this day what would bring you peace. But now it's hidden from your eyes, for the days will come upon you when your enemies will barricade you and surround you from every side. This is him about to enter Jerusalem. There's another reference in Luke, and I especially want you to hear this one. Jesus says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those sent to her. This is Jesus himself saying this. This is his words. Jerusalem, who kills the prophets sent to her and stones them and persecutes them. Jerusalem is known for this. And the leaders of the Jews at this time are all up in Jerusalem. Of course, people are persecuted for righteousness and for his sake. When he looks at Jerusalem, he says, how I've longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were unwilling. So this thing that he's saying here in the Beatitudes, blessed are you when you're persecuted for my sake. And you notice it's not just anytime somebody persecutes you. He's specifically talking about persecuted for my sake. He says, rejoice and be glad, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets before you. This idea of being persecuted for his sake, I don't want to say fear, but I suspect we're going to see more of this in the not too distant future. In China, they are rewriting, they have rewritten lots of the Bible, and they've changed it so that it's more conducive to their government and to communism, et cetera. And the people there who want to worship God, the people there who are Christian, will not have access to the Bible as we know it. And it's perverse. It is changed in ways that no longer make sense. These Beatitudes would not make sense in the context of this new Bible. And we're seeing more and more, at the World Cup, they had personalized jerseys, and anyone who wanted Jesus on their jersey, it was banned. We're going to see more of that. He's telling them at that time, you're going to see this. You're going to see people, if you choose service to me, you're going to be persecuted. And you have to rejoice and be glad, because you understand that means you're representing what I'm teaching you, and they're going to persecute you for it. But at least you'll have some feedback. At least you'll know that you're doing it right, because there are going to be people who just disapprove, and they'll find ways to make your life miserable. Mary, you have anything else?
No, I think this, and just to bring it back to a higher level, remember, so this is almost his introduction. He's telling this large group of people, I am talking to you, which would surprise them. You are the ones I'm talking to. You're not the rich and the famous, you're not the religiously important, but I'm talking to you. And then before he starts preaching to them, if you will, or telling him what's important, he goes into this next section that I think, are you all right with me going to this next section on the
Sure.
salt and light?
If you
On
were
this
here, you'd be tapping my leg. Move on. Hold on,
This
Jesus.
next, go ahead.
Do we have any study on the temporal scope of these beatitudes? I think we have been saying he's talking to the poor, right then and there. I think he's talking to all of us. Today, he's talking to us.
Sure, sure.
So when we say stuff like, and he does, the poor in spirit, that's him, that's us. Right?
As are so many things that he teaches at that time, yes.
Yeah, like, blessed are the peacemakers. I mean, the first word that comes to me is war, fight, struggle. He's talking about here. He might be talking about the peacemaker of this soul and this spirit with the one contrary, because there's only one God. That's Jesus. It also speaks about the connection of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and there's struggle there. And if you read these things, you see these Beatitudes, it's one book.
The message has not changed. Certainly, when he says the kingdom of God is at hand or the kingdom of heaven is at hand, it's because he's here. Things have changed, but the message and the intent, and we'll actually cover that in this next section, has not changed. And it absolutely, certainly, this was a teaching for those people at that time, but it carries through. We have to look at it as it carries through to us. These are not just lessons because they live under Romans. I mean, we live under Romans. They're just not from Rome. So yeah, it's.
I think an important part, the reason we want to know what he was saying and to whom he was saying it then is so we don't misinterpret it now. So many times we look at it, and actually this next section on salt and light is sort of a good example, because this next example, so he has now said, you guys out there, I'm talking to you. Now, before I tell you what I'm going to say, I'm going to tell you something else. And these next verses, 13 through 16, many of you have heard, and they're usually, it's a reading 13 through 16, and then they do a sermon on the salt and the light. But I'm gonna tell you something about salt, and then I want you to listen to it, because it's one of those things that, as Scott and I listened to a lot of sermons over the last 2 weeks on salt and light, some of it doesn't make sense. You know, you think to yourself, does salt lose its saltiness, is one of the things. So anyhow, I want to read you, some of you who participated last year in our Sabbath or dinner, where we did first century. It was a lot of those recipes I got from a first century cookbook, if you will. And they went back and not only talked about the recipes, but the importance of food. And there's a section, just a couple of sentences, I'm going to read you on salt. And I want to read you on salt before I read the section on salt and light, because it makes a lot more sense. And the author was saying that Jesus used things that the people of that day would understand, and they would understand salt. It was a very important part of their life, and they would understand it. It was easy for people to understand salt because they saw salt was placed on the table in a lump on a small dish, together with the soil that got mixed in with both during the mining of the shores of the Dead Sea. So that's where they would get the salt, from the Dead Sea shores, and they'd have dirt in it. When all the white crystals had been picked out of the dish and sprinkled over their food, the remaining soil with tiny bits of salt that were worthless as flavoring were then indeed, quote from Matthew 5:13, thrown out and trampled by men. So I wanted to read that, so when you listen to this, you might hear it a little different. So
Yeah,
I'm on
and
that.
just so that's clear, they didn't have box salt. And they didn't have crystals that were all the same size and stuff. They had a lump. And the stuff washes down and hits the Dead Sea, and the water evaporates, and what's left is a lump. We went there and it looked like the Dead Sea was frozen because the chemical, the crystals at the top look like ice. And I'm kind of a scientific guy. I read this from way back and I thought, what do you mean if salt loses its flavor? Salt, you take a box of salt, leave it in the shelf, come back in 20 years, and it's still sodium chloride. It's still salty. It doesn't change. But now if you understand, they have the lump that they put on a dish and they flake out the crystals, and there's also dirt. And when you've gotten all you can out of the lump, there's dirt left over. It's worthless.
So one of the things we heard this week was about salt being, what it means is it's watered down. And then Scott says, and then as the water evaporated, it would be salt again.
It's
I mean,
still
it was not a
salt.
good, Jesus would do
always
better
was.
analogy than that.
But, so go ahead if you want. I'm sorry, but go ahead
Okay.
and read.
Okay, so I'm on Matthew 5, verse 13. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its savor, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a basket. Instead, they set it out on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven.
So a lot gets made out of salt. Salt is used as a preservative. Salt is used to give things flavor. Salt is used to make something palatable that might be close to going over, becoming inedible. It's important to them. And it's obviously it's a metaphor, but he's telling them that's sort of your role in this world. You disciples, you who are following me, that's going to be your role in this world. I want you to preserve, to stave off the corruption of this place. And if you walk away, as sometimes people do, if you salt loses its savor, you're really of no value anymore. You're just like the rest of the people. So he's preparing them. Blessed are you. And now he begins to say, if you follow me, if you take this up, you're going to be the salt. You're going to be this thing that has value to the world. And the idea of light, we take an awful lot for granted, living in a place where there's street lights. And I mean, on a cloudy night, you can practically go outside and read because the light reflects off the clouds and it's bright. We have light everywhere. They did not. The verse that says your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. People in darkness are at a distinct disadvantage. And they were, and this was a big deal to have light. And he says, you're the light of this world now. You're reflecting my light, but you're going to have an important purpose in being light for a world in darkness. A city on a hill can't be hidden. Jerusalem is one of those. It's known as being that. For miles and miles at night, you look in and your eyes drawn because there's Jerusalem. There are enough people, there's enough light. It can't be hidden. Your light won't be hidden. And he said, this is sort of a famous saying, but you light a lamp, you don't hide it under a basket. Light was too precious. You put it on a stand so that everybody can receive the light from it. You don't be selfish with it. Nobody would do that. And he's saying, you're going to be a light to the world. And it's not something to be hidden. You're going to have to stand up and shine in that way. This is a teaching. This is him beginning this ministry and training people.
I think it's
But
important for verse 16 not to be misinterpreted. And in the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So the concept that those good deeds, this is not saying the good deeds are getting you into heaven. It's saying the good deeds you do because you are a believer,
bring
other
glory to
people
God.
get to see and say, hey, there's something different about you.
That's our job. That's our role. I'm sorry, you were still saying?
No, go ahead.
And this, put yourself in their position, the beginning of his ministry. This is what this teaching is. This is something new that's going on. Well, and as Gene mentioned, it carries to us. If you're going to be a disciple, you're going to say, I'm following, then, you know, you're going to be on display. And the idea is that people will see the glory of God expressed in you. And at least some of them will say, hey, this looks and feels different than what I see in the newspaper and what I read on the internet. What's the difference? And it's, you know, broken down like that. It's not a complicated teaching. The next part gets complicated.
Well, this, I'm going to do a true confession, or whatever you usually, your comment is, Scott. And Scott and I were talking, and we were studying on Wednesday night, this next section. And I said, you know, I'm just not sure there's a lot to talk about. This stuff is just, you know, everybody's heard it before. And then the more and Scott says, no, not really. I mean, and you might have heard it one way, but it's deeper than that. So I will challenge everybody as we read this next section. So he's now starting to say, he's welcomed everybody. He said, I'm speaking to you. He says, you know, you're going to need to learn this because you're going to be the light and the salt going forward. And now I'm going to teach you some things. And one of those scenes in The Chosen was, you know, someone said, Jesus, you have rough edges, when the women were trying to dress him up. And he says, oh, you mean my teach? And one of the women said, your teaching is sometimes harsh. And what was his comment? Like, you
Just
haven't
wait.
heard anything yet. Just wait.
Yeah. If you
And
think
so
it's
he was just about, he was just about to say the Sermon on the Mount. Just wait, this is tough. There's an analogy, Scott, that I would like. One of the ministers, and it's a guy that his name's Tim Mackey, and he's the one who does the Bible Project, and we've shown you some of his videos, but he's also just a preacher in a church, and he did a great sermon series on this section of Matthew, and he did an analogy of what it means to be living in this world but being part of a different kingdom. Do you want to talk about the analogy of driving?
Well, he talked about England. He said there are only a few countries in the world, relatively few, that drive on the left side of the road. And he said that he imagines that probably a majority of the accidents that occur are people coming from somewhere else that are used to driving on the right side of the road. But he said, what would happen if we all decided to get up and go outside and start driving on the left-hand side of the road? And he said there would be collisions that you know, you can understand that people will not understand this, and there will be collisions, right? You want to say the rest, or you?
Yeah, well, and the other point is, he's not saying, when he's saying, you know, the kingdom is near and we're to be part of this new kingdom, but here on earth, that we're not supposed to, as some religious groups do, separate ourselves from this world and start a new city where everybody drives on the left-hand side of the road. We're supposed to drive on the left-hand side of the road in this world, and it's okay if there's collisions. I mean, that was the sort of what I walked away with.
Yeah. I guess before we leave this part of the Beatitudes, peacemakers and the meek, and we have in our churches, I told you I've seen a church split over coffee. because some people went to drink coffee and some other people said it's just wrong. And they literally split in two.
In a
I've-
service, yeah.
I've seen them split over what color to paint the fellowship hall. And the idea of being, meek, being a peacemaker, being the light of the world, it does not represent this kingdom of heaven. It doesn't represent Jesus' teachings well. We're not a light, a city on a hill that's lit when people see us beating each other up over the color in the fellowship hall. And I was on an elder in a church, and it doesn't matter what it was. There was a vote, and everybody was sort of on one side. And one person spoke up and began, and it was a silly thing. It was just silly. And I thought, I could start talking and turn this the other direction. And I didn't. And afterwards, the person, and they got their way. They got their way, said, I thank you for not fighting over this. And I said, what would be the point of that? It's in the big scheme of things, this is something that's only internal to us to begin with. If we're fighting over that, it's not like we're debating whether or not we should be going out and telling other people about our faith. This is this silly thing. And this idea of being light and salt is no small thing. It isn't. And the way we treat each other is part of this idea of being the light. And he says that people will see your good deeds and glorify God through it. It's not good deeds for our own sake. So anyway, that's probably and it will, though, it will be at times like driving on the left side of the road. Let's move on. Mary, you want to read the next section?
Sure. I'm on Matthew 5, verse 17 through 20. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For I tell you truly, until heaven and earth pass away, not a single jot, not a stroke of a pen will disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. So then, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do likewise will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.
So I struggled with this terribly. And there are a whole bunch of people who look at this and say, we are required to follow the Old Testament law still, that we're in it, but it says so right there. And that's what they'll tell you. It says so right there. Whoever, because it's hard to refute, instinctively that that's not what Jesus is saying. It's not consistent with anything that he taught. It's not consistent with anything that comes out in the later parts of the New Testament. And yet he says, don't think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets.
And first of all, the law is more than just the 10 commandments. What is the law?
Well, you got to be careful with that, because I struggled with this until about midnight last night.
What's the answer?
I'm not saying that's an answer, but I'm saying there are clues there's some clues here that are easy to overlook. So let's start with this, and you can see how somebody looks at this. I tell you that until heaven and earth pass away, not one little dot from the law is going to disappear from the law. And it sure sounds like what he's saying is, you got to follow the law. You got to do what the Pharisees are saying. So don't think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. How do you abolish the prophets? What does that even mean? That seems kind of odd, doesn't it? I don't think that's in there for no reason. The fact is, as I said earlier, the prophets frequently came and told the leaders that, because what they did with the law, remember the law starts with 10 commandments. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not commit adultery. There's some pretty simple little list for you. And they turned that, as years and centuries went on, the Jewish leaders turned it into 613 rules called mitzvahot. The mitzvah is plural, mitzvahot, 613. And there is stuff in Jewish Torah law, like you can't mix different kinds of fibers, threads in a single garment. No cotton and flax mixed. How do you feel that represents God's will for us? I mean, do you think that's a law that comes directly from God? But that's what they turned it into. And I don't even know why. Maybe the Cotton Growers Guild, lobby got involved in this. But you wonder what was going through their heads. And there's one, and I hope you'll pardon me, but it's in there and you'll understand. If two men sort of are arguing with each other, one of them comes to the other one's house and starts a fight. And I mean a fight. And if in the middle of it, the wife of the man who lives in the house gets involved and grabs the intruder by the extremities, she's to be killed. She's to be put to death. Yeah, there's a rule for that in the law. And it doesn't make sense. But this is what they turned the law into. And there, as I said, 603 extra. I got corrected this week because the original 10, 603 extra, but then they began to do what's called the Mishnah, which is they began to take the 613 and the oral tradition branches out. So they have written their own. They've turned it into something. And the prophets often came and said, God told me to come and tell you, you missed the point. You've completely gone off the rails here. And as I said, the prophets are frequently persecuted and killed for doing that. The king wants things his own way. And this prophet comes up and says, no, that's not what God was saying. So to abolish the law and the prophets is sort of contradictory. So how does that make sense? And if you go on, he says, I'll tell you truly that until heaven and earth pass away, not a single jot, not a stroke of the pen will disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. The law that comes from God isn't going away. I didn't come to abolish the law. I may contradict some of the stuff that you people have done to it, because in Jerusalem, the leaders are doing some horrific things and saying that God says do this. They have become political to the point that it really has nothing to do with God. So he's telling these people, I'm not here to get rid of the law. The law is going to be with us. The law was handed down by God. Now, this other stuff, not so much. He's preparing them. And that's what he gets charged with a lot, is that he's trying to abolish the law. He wants to get rid of the leaders in Jerusalem, and they're clearly threatened by that. So when you look at it in that context, yeah, it makes a little more sense, I think. And he says, so then, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do likewise will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Well, the least of these, he's going to tell us what he means by that. And that's what we lose. All of, people tend to focus on one sentence and miss the fact that he's got a teaching going on here. And in later verses, he's going to explain what he means by that. But he says, for I tell you, here's the important part. If the people who do keep the law and do teach it will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness, put yourself in that audience, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, you got to listen closely. You got to picture what they would hear. He's just told them that the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees isn't good enough. In fact, it's no good at all. Unless your righteousness exceeds theirs, you won't see the kingdom of heaven. You won't see the kingdom of God. This is kind of harsh on them, but he's telling them, you're right now being stepped on by these people and their 613 and thousands of rules. Blessed are you. Now I'm telling you that I'm not here to abolish the law. God gave the law. God explained to us things, but I am here to tell you that unless you do better than what you see coming out of Jerusalem, you've missed the boat, right? Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me, but if we're talking about the Ten Commandments, Moses, right?
Right?
Tell me that. What's the first commandment?
What's the most important commandment?
What's the first commandment?
Yeah.
Does it really matter? It just means it ties what he's talking about, the law. God did those commandments and you should have no other God before me. Right?
That's one of the important ones.
Yeah. So now we have these, let me say 16 other, and to me, that sounds to me like commentary on the first 10 commandments. Some human being's idea of what those 10 commandments mean.
Well, funny you should mention that because I came prepared for it. For I tell you, well, actually what he says is that until heaven and earth are destroyed and until everything has been fulfilled, that word fulfilled, right? I mean, that's what he says. Until everything has been fulfilled, the law is not going away. The law is here for a purpose, but what does it mean to be fulfilled? So I'm going to read to you from out of Luke. This is Luke 4, starting at 16. Jesus came to the synagogue where he'd been brought up, and they give him a scroll. They give him the scroll of Isaiah. And now it's typically an honor to be given that scroll, but I think they thought they were going to embarrass him. They were going to hand him one of the hardest things. They said, here, read from Isaiah. And he immediately comes down and he reads this. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Okay, that's what he reads. And all of these important people think he's talking about them. And they're really happy with it. And then he says, and this is what's important, listen to this. After reading this from Isaiah, he says, then he rolled up the scroll, returned it to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began by saying, today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing, right? They thought that he was talking about their august assembly. And he says, it's been fulfilled in me. I fulfill this. And they got mad and wanted to kill him. And that's a story for another time. But he has proclaimed to them that that was about him and that he has fulfilled what was prophesied in Isaiah. And when he talks about, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. The law is here for a reason. And it's not a bunch of rules for us to get beaten up with. It's about the heart. It's about how we see other people. And when Jesus is asked, which commandment is the most important? He says, well, what do you think? And the guy says, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might. And he says, that's a good one. And love your neighbor as yourself. He says, yeah, the entire law is wrapped up in those two things. That's what he's teaching. You don't need 613 mitzvah. Oh, you don't need thousands and thousands of breaking down little rules. We've told you when we were in Israel, they had a Shabbat elevator. You're not some, so you get on it and it stops at every floor on the way up. It stops at every floor on the way down, because they determined you're not supposed to work on Shabbat. So we're gonna trick it and do a Shabbat elevator.
Because
It's
pressing
all-
the button is working.
What?
Because pressing the button is
Because
working.
pressing the button would be work.
Oh.
Thank you, Mary. I was thinking, that was it. That's what they've done with the law. It's ridiculous what they've done with the law. And he says, I didn't come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill the actual intent, the meaning in a very real sense. And Virginia, I hope you appreciate this, because we had a discussion where you said he is our peace, literally. He is the law. What he's teaching is the law. And so of course it's not going to go away. I didn't come to abolish the law. But he says, I'm going to tell you, all of you who are here to follow me, that unless your righteousness is greater than these Pharisees who are beating you up with all of these things, unless it's greater than theirs, you won't see the kingdom of heaven. Now,
And what I'd like to do, Scotty, because I'm not there to squeeze your leg, is I want to read the first one and challenge you guys to read through Matthew this week. So when we take up, so this is the part that I was telling Scott, everybody has heard this and it's not that hard. And it becomes really hard because, as Scott said, what Jesus was telling this group, and one has to wonder, did they all understand it? Some did. And even today, through our walks, we understand it better every time we hear it, I think, is part of the thing. But this is changing the heart and how we view people. So it's not, there was these 10 commandments, and a lot of this next part addresses one of those commandments and says, hey, you heard the rule and you said this first one, do not murder. A lot of people sitting there, well, that one doesn't pertain to me because I haven't murdered. And he's letting everybody know that every one of these pertains to you because it's about the heart. So I just want to read the first one, and I don't think we're going to have time to discuss it, but just listen to it from the standpoint is this was so much more than one of the 10 commandments. This is Jesus saying, if you didn't need to make 613 rules, you needed to understand what it meant to take it from the heart and how you view other people. So I'm at Matthew 5, verse 21. You have heard that it was said to the ancients, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, will be subject to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says you fool will be subject to the fire of hell. So if you're offering your gifts to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift.
let's stop there because
Okay.
it gets more complicated. So I'm sorry if this has been complicated today, but what we'd like you to see is that this is a teaching to followers, to disciples, and he's explaining to them that you've been led astray, this obsession with the rules, and he tells them your righteousness has to exceed even that of the Pharisees. And what I've missed all of my life is immediately Because there are people going, oh my gosh, we've got to be better rule followers than the Pharisees. No, the very next sentence, he says, unless your righteousness is greater than the Pharisees and the scribes, you won't see the kingdom of heaven. And he says, you've heard it said, this is a continuation. This is the same, he's saying, this is how your righteousness has to be greater than theirs. You've heard it said, do not murder. But I'm telling you, it's much more than that. If you carry this murderous rage in your heart, if you despise your brother enough to call, say, you fool, you're already guilty. I don't care what the law says. The law says if you don't pick up a hammer and, bash their skull in, you're free and clear. Everything's okay. And he's saying that's not the point of the law. The point of the law is how you view and by your brother, that means, your neighbor. Who's my neighbor, right? This is one thing. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees. Now, here's an example of how that works. Don't kill somebody, don't murder. But I'm telling you, if you go around in your heart carrying this rage, you're not part of what I'm teaching.
And then he tells you what to do about it. And he says, if you're about to basically, go to church, make an offering, say a prayer, act like you're holy, whatever, leave your gifts there before the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift.
And this is the thing. The law says the sacrifice is everything. Bring us your money, bring us your cows that we'll burn for you, and then we'll eat the meat afterwards and everything. Bring the sacrifice. And what Jesus is saying, that's what the Pharisees and scribes teach. And I'm telling you, if you bring your sacrifice to the altar and you realize that you're carrying this sort of anger at your brother, at your neighbor, leave the sacrifice and go be reconciled with your neighbor. Take care of that first. Take care of the heart and then come back. I'm not saying don't make a sacrifice, but the sacrifice comes after. Does that make sense? Do you see, maybe for the first time, for me, it was the first time. This is one thing. You have to do better than what the Pharisees do, because they look at the letter of the law. And as long as I can get by with saying, well, I met the letter of the law, I'm okay. And he's saying, you're not okay. It's not okay to do this. Huh?
You're missing the point.
You're
You're not only not okay, you're just missing the point.
And to that extent, he is the law. He's teaching what the law was supposed to be. And he's come to fulfill what the law was supposed to be. He tells us that. I didn't come to abolish it. I came to fulfill it. In the same way he said that prophecy in Isaiah is fulfilled in me. The law, this is the real law. This is the meaning of the law, and I'm here to fulfill it. Is that okay?
It's 10:03 or 10:04, prayer time.
God, we know that you have a purpose for us. You have a desire for us, and you continue to deal with us, even though we don't deserve it. And we know that you have a will for our lives. You tell us that we're salt and light, and sometimes we struggle about how to be that, how to do that. And as so often is the case, I'm grateful, I am thankful that you leave behind for us these words that explain to us who we're supposed to be, who we can be, how we find the life more abundant that you have for us. And it seems to me sometimes so easy and at other times so difficult. And we understand, hopefully, that the only way we can deal with the difficult part is through faith and trust. in you and your words. Remind us of that. Show us that. Open these words up to us, that we can understand that we have the ability to be light in this world. But it's not just by following rules. The rules that are most important is love your neighbor and love you with all of our heart and soul and might. Be with us this week. Keep this message like a coal in our hearts, something that stays and burns, so that we remember it as we see all the opportunities to meet the letter of the law and not the purpose. In Jesus' name, amen.
And
I can.
everybody can unmute themselves.
Have a great time celebrating the new baby to come.
Yeah. When is your baby due?
Finley is due December 30th, and we'll see if she goes that far. Like I said, she gained 9 pounds this week, so
Oh my gosh.
she is like, what is the person on
Baruka
Charlie
Salt.
Chocolate Pack? Pardon me? Baruka, that's what she looks like. Her little toes are so fat.
Well, something's not right.
Yeah, something's not right. She's actually holding lots of fluid, but
Fluids,
anyhow,
yeah.
she'll be okay, but keep her in your prayers. And I am headed back in a couple of hours. And so Scott, don't move the entire house out to the garage.
No promises there, Mary.
You only have a couple of hours to do what you want to do before she gets back.
Oh, my goodness. Well, safe travels back, Mary.
Thank
Can I tell you
you.
one other thing? Those of you who saw The Chosen, I mentioned this here, but The Chosen has shocked Hollywood yet again, because they're making more money on their opening weekend than a whole bunch of these big studio productions that are supposed to be Oscar contenders. And they just don't understand.
So and that's a good thing. If you guys have some time over the Thanksgiving weekend, season 3, episode 1 and 2 are going to be at certain movie theaters. Like in the Gulf Coast, there's only 2 movie theaters in Corpus that have it. I'm sure there's a couple in San Antonio and up in Austin, but you have to look to where it's not in every movie theater.
One
but
of the
it's-
projected Oscar contenders is in a lot more theaters and is taken in way, way less at the box. So, yeah,
That's exciting.
yeah. Good to see you all. Bye-bye.
Have a great week, everybody.
Bye.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving.